Hi there. Test? Hi there. My name is Adam, and I'd like to talk to you about the sights and sounds of one of the most interesting pieces of culture we can still participate in today. It's the concentrated product of generations of craft put into one package. Some would say it's dying, if not already dead. If this is true, the question becomes, who killed it? How? Why? The explanation I offer is not a comprehensive history of how opera changed. Rather, I'm not even going to play much more opera for you. Rather, I offer a story of how opera changed history. There will be spoilers. The bit that played earlier did so without warning for a reason. That's how opera started for generations. The overture did the work of mustering the milling public long before dimmable house lights or public announcements. It comes from Verdi's opera, La Traviata. In English, we'd call it The Fallen Woman. Our heroine is a courtesan throwing a party for her clientele. She's just recovered from some kind of sickness and is ready to get back to work. Some rich bumpkin gets invited. He's smitten. He pursues Violetta. What ensues is the tragedy of mixing business with pleasure. It ends with a consumed Violetta on her death. Actually, It ends with a consumed Violetta on her deathbed. It gives melodrama. Some of it was bawdy. It premiered in 1853 in Venice. It became one of Verdi's most performed operas for over the next few years, and today is still one of the most performed. Its sequence of arias, duets, trios, cavatinas, finales, it was predictable. And most of these were just musicalifications of popular books or plays at the time. Bits of music were clearly taken from other works, only some of which Verdi composed. Earworms are earworms. For generations, all of this would have happened in front of what was essentially a party. Not pictured are the hawkers, with booze and finger food for sale. Yes, this went on during the performance. It was so common, in fact, that it gave rise to a phenomenon called the sorbet aria, placed sometime in Act 2, where rising cast members or rising composers could show what they've got, time for when spoons would clink. The curtain would close and everybody would go home. They would return again next week, later in the week, for whatever was showing. When La Traviata premiered, Venice was at the center of music, of the music world. It was coming off of centuries at the center of the music world. The reasons for it are multifaceted, but a lot of it comes down to its trade network. The Venetians had created a cultural machine that operated much like a business. Years of trading with the most wealthy, the islands were filled with independent merchants and offered multiple opera houses, competing for a finite market for ticket revenue. Those with money found artists to create for the machine, often expecting a return on investment at the box office. Reruns and revivals were quite common, especially if they made money. This created a microeconomy and a training ground for musicians across Europe that would become a foundation and recurring feature for almost every opera house around the world, operating at the time. It's also the reason why middle school band involves Italian vocabulary lessons. It's hard to overstate Venetian influence on music. Years of trading with the most wealthy and influential across Europe gave Venetians relatively neutral access in what was otherwise a world of distrust. The most common model was that an aristocrat owned a theater and provided a standing pool of musicians. Traveling shows would come in and they'd bring the stars to perform the most popular works of the day. From time to time, local productions would get staged using the excess capacity of those salaried musicians, and most of these would never be seen or heard from again. Some of them, like Mozart's collection, would even break into the circuit. The new collection of voices by the beginning of the 19th century, not just from Vienna, but also Paris, London, Berlin, and Munich, were changing what stories were seen by whom. The world outside the opera house was changing too. In 1806, Napoleon forced hundreds of fractured principalities east of the Rhine to join up with their larger neighbors into names we'd recognize today: Saxony, Bavaria, Prussia. After Waterloo, Napoleon retreated, and those new states had to organize military alliances that started to look like cultural alliances and then spheres of influence, all to prevent Napoleon from happening again. The result was that there were fewer theaters for these itinerant Italians to visit. Those that were available started becoming more intentional patrons of the arts themselves. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution is giving us a growing middle class that is increasingly urban, affluent, and available for entertainment. Italian influence was still very strong, but delivered increasingly in the language they spoke at home. When the conductor position for the Dresden Opera came open in 1843, the retirement of an imported Italian, the King of Saxony appointed a rising local composer who had just become talk of the town for his Italian language opera. The guy was known for idiosyncratic interpretations, rigorous rehearsals, and general iconoclastic tendencies. He would stage his own works with artistic liberty, but as a condition of his contract, he couldn't get too weird with the classics. His first German language opera was a commercial bust. The story is a tale from time mythological about a captain and a woman who falls in love with the idea of a man she can't have. More interesting is that the orchestra actually becomes a force unto its own. We get a swell of stormy seas in churning strings. We get the ominous sounds of an augmented brass section. And we would get little short motifs that followed characters and concepts around from beginning to end, themselves developing with the plot. It also offered a lot of things that the Dresden audience was probably not ready for. There was no spoken dialogue. The orchestra was loud, and it played from beginning to end until the curtain dropped. It was hard to know when to clap and swoon, no numbered arias to anticipate your sorbet. He would complete another, but it's here where his theses become clear. The story created two very distinct spheres. We'll get there. We open on Venusberg, a land of pleasure and opulence that hides neither the composer's disdain for the practice nor the fact that it is a metaphor for Italian sensibility. Our hero is unfulfilled by the conveyor belt of booze, snacks, and sex. After a heated argument with Venus herself, he leaves the grotto to go back into the real world. The trials and tribulations of mortal existence lead him to a final moment of decision. He must choose where to abode and abide. He chooses the world that makes one weary. A triumphant chorus concludes the lesson. Turns out this composer-conductor was also a revolutionary who wanted things like a constitutional monarchy. The Kapellmeister was fired for participation in an insurrection against the Saxon king, part of the 1848 uprisings that were popping up all across Europe. Our now former Kapellmeister took exile in Switzerland with a bounty on his head. A friend and his eventual father-in-law, Franz Liszt, staged the latest evolution of his ideas, basically complete by the time he took to the barricades. The composer wouldn't see it performed live for obvious reasons. Instead, he'd live basically hand to mouth for the next 15 years, living off royalties, working on his ideas. His goal was to unify sights, sounds, and semiotics into a single entity, which the Germans, of course, have a word for, Gesamtkunstwerk. Many of you have probably realized that I'm now talking about Richard Wagner, one of the most conflicting characters in history, not just the history of music. He'd spend that time plotting a 15-hour-long, 4-part epic affectionately called The Ring Cycle. Its premise is this: treasure from the mermaids has been stolen. The marauder, a troll, the prize, gold, to be forged into a ring to rule them all. The twist, you'll never be happy ever again. Meanwhile, the king of the gods tries to short his laborers on a palace he just built. In doing so, he sets off a chain of events, destroying owner after owner of this ring in their quest for absolute power. Bismarck becomes Prime Minister of Prussia in 1862, and the strongest counterpoint to his rising dominance was Bavaria, which was flourishing scientifically and artistically under Maximilian II. Fortunately for Wagner, Maximilian soon dies. By 1864, now in his early 50s, things look pretty bad for Richard. Deep in debt, on the edge of arrest, no patrons, no prospect, only his ideas. The new king, 18 years old, stunningly handsome, shy, a bit neurotic, presumed homosexual, and beaten by the press for all of these things, sends for Richard. Tell him I can do everything for him. Wagner is found in Stuttgart. King Ludwig offers him a villa, assumption of debts, and 10 times what he made in Dresden, and complete artistic freedom. The revolutionary, expelled for treason, cozies up to an absolute monarch. While in exile, Wagner composed another piece, Tristan and Isolde. Its exercise in tonality bending and just brute endurance, it would define the careers of people who could do it well and would mar the careers of those who probably shouldn't have. It's serious stuff. Okay. It was funded in 1865 without much question. The bliss was short, though. Wagner was pushed out by Ludwig's cabinet for the inordinate influence he seemed to have on the young and impressionable king. Richard gets sent back to Switzerland to finish his magnum opus, still collecting his royal salary, and the two would continue meeting from time to time just to check in. Rising tensions between Austria and Prussia brought more war. Bavaria, aligned with its eastern neighbor for reasons involving the Pope, is forced into a puppet-like alliance with Prussia after the alliance's defeat at Königgrätz. Ludwig, diplomatically neutered but still very rich, redoubles his investment in Wagner. Richard returns again from exile. But the incubation period was almost over. The first two installments of The Ring premiered in Munich's Court Theater a year apart from each other. Plans were already underway for a theater built to Wagner's exacting specifications for the rest of it. Bismarck forms the German Empire in December 1871, which ended any remaining political power Ludwig had. It gave him more time for his hobbies. The cornerstone of the Promised Theater was laid a year and a half later in Bayreuth. It would take 4 years to finish, but it would open with the premiere of The Ring's third installment. Inside, the floor fans out and up like a Greek amphitheater. There are no boxes. Continental seating differentiates the audience only by proximity to stage. The orchestra was even below the stage, the source of sound obscured. No distractions. The next convention may have been accidental. As the performance started, the gas lights overhead went out. This startled the who's who in the music audience, including Tchaikovsky of Nutcracker fame, who was there to report on it for his article in the Russian Register. Other people reported a grayish twilight, and Wagner claimed technical malfunction, but the show must go on. We meet Siegfried. He's raised by dwarves that forged the ring in question. He thinks he's an orphan. The audience knows he's the product of twin incest, which was the point of installment number 2. It seems he's going to be the one to put an end to all of this nonsense. He goes on a quest that involves dragons and an acid trip. His moment of clarity leads him to a damsel in distress, the first woman he's ever met, Brunhilde. She also happens to be the king's daughter. Only true love can break the spell. Only the audience knows that he's her nephew and that they're about to fuck it all up. The fourth installment premiered the next day. Our hero dies in Act 3 after encounters with a memory potion, a jealous husband, and an unwitting betrayal of Brunhilde. It ends with Brunhilde's self-immolation onto his funeral pyre. The ring is returned to the Rhine, the curse lifted, and the empire of the gods is destroyed in spectacular blaze. It's apocalyptic, a world built on theft, power, and greed must burn. Maybe it was apoptosis. Our last sight is of a flowing Rhine, mermaids reunited with their gold, and falling ash. The last 4.5 minutes are among my favorite in the entire repertory. Unlike a trip to La Traviata, there would be no escape after the curtain closes. The world would not shut up about it. The plot was confusing, the music sometimes very dense, but the total effect was debilitating. Wagner would stage a few more operas, but the damage was already done. Before long, people were sitting still in the dark to look at genius on stage, no matter the composer. Wagner died in 1883 in, of all places, Venice. His shadow paralyzed the musical establishment, particularly in Germany, and destabilized it everywhere else. To imitate him was derivative. To reject him was to miss the point. To ignore him was impossible. Opera became a foundational element of later nationalist movements in Bohemia, using the form to develop their own aesthetic among their own middle class in their own language in the same opera houses that gave rise to Mozart. French composers like Saint-Saëns and Debussy would argue among themselves about what French music looked like, but they were aligned against the dangers of Wagnerism on distinctly French sensibilities. Verdi, a man of the Venetian machine, had experimented with form and substance after La Traviata, complete with elephants on stage, but returned from a 16-year-long hiatus to give Wagner's ideas a try. He would die in 1901. Within 2 years, La Scala, the big opera house in Milan, would retrofit to the Wagnerian custom, which is where Puccini stages heart-wrenching tales of love and oppression to some of the best music cultural evolution can offer, with Wagnerian through lines. The best the German machine could come up with was Humperdinck. Eventually, a different Richard seemed poised to carry the musical tradition forward. Strauss this time, but not related to the guy who wrote waltzes. This guy was the son of a horn player in Ludwig's court orchestra. He'd adopted Wagnerian techniques in his whimsical and quixotic tone poems. He even set Nietzsche's manifesto about the death of God to fanfare and timpani. His gift was descriptive and expressive music, but his early attempts at opera were failures. It would take until 1905 and a cosmic chain of events worth its own Nerd Night talk. As a teaser, it involves conservative London audiences bemused by Gilbert and Sullivan, an Irish lad, the Dresden Opera House, a political prisoner from the Bible, a teenage femme fatale giving a striptease for her uncle, and 7 minutes in heaven with a severed head. It was short, 90 minutes, one act, no intermission. There wasn't even an overture, it just started. What slithered out was the crown jewel of German opera. Salome gave us leitmotif, orchestra forward, well-timed theater, tonal experimentation, and complete exhaustion by the end. The result was postcoital. There was nowhere else to go, and it's about here that things fall apart. Strauss pushed things a bit further with Elektra, but he realized what he had done, and he retreated aesthetically back to more Mozartian values. World War I did a number on Germany. The social and economic structure basically collapsed overnight in a train car in the woods. A few new works would sputter out, but only one really entered the canon, Albenberg's Wozzeck. It's a terrifying exploration of post-traumatic stress disorder and descent into psychosis. Our hero is crushed from every direction. His boss mocks him. He participates in medical experiments for money. He hallucinates as a side effect. And the mother of his child is being seduced by a man who seems to suffer no indignities at all. The worst part, that's not a hallucination. Everybody knows about it. There will be no help for him. Only inexorable forces that grind him until he snaps and kills his lover in a blind rage. His pursuit ends in a drowning, unclear if suicide or by cop. The curtain drops as their kid, now orphaned, continues playing with their toys. It uses easily identifiable musical forms, but little our ears would actually recognize as music. Most theaters rejected it. The Berlin State Opera, the successor to the Prussian court opera, took it on because of one particularly insistent creative director. It was a sensational scandal that would drive a wedge into Germany's gurgling culture wars. In 1933, it was classified as degenerate work, the same year that Strauss became the head minister of music for global culture apparatus. The Second World War ended all of this. There's no hero to save the day this time. The Second World War ended all of this, not just in Germany, but across Europe. Many performers who had been keeping this machine moving would die in those wars. Those who survived saw a blasted landscape. In many places, there wasn't even an opera house to go to. A few retreated into the academy, and some left. A few went to Hollywood, If you think about it, the entire film industry is built on the Gesamtkunstwerk and its scales. Don't worry, we're almost done. When I start talking to my friends, and now total strangers, about Wagner, I'm sometimes asked a variation of, why do you obsess over this? What I find fascinating about this story is not whether Wagner's ideas were good or bad, but rather what happens when something like Wagner exists. I'm interested in that lasting legacy. What does it feel like when participating in culture is no longer optional? When the forces of distribution, aesthetic, and patronage concentrate so tightly that it's just intoxicating. When those forces collapse, where does that energy go? So I guess we're left with the question, what's the point of opera anymore? Few new works have entered the canon in the last 100 years. What's going on? Here's my take. Participation is more like going to a museum than going to a party. It has a fascinating history, and its greatest hits have been ambient entertainment for most of our lives. The model lives on, just in transfigured form, but there's something that Looney Tunes can't convey, which is the rising heat and smell of an auditorium wrapped in an evolving crescendo, the density of air as the heroine belts her dying breaths, the feeling of imminent unraveling as the orchestra maneuvers around precisely placed sounds. It's a group of hundreds of musicians who are at the peak of their career, and they've been working their entire lives for that exact moment to occur, and it's exquisite. Thanks for listening. I'm curious to hear your take. What questions do you have?
I can start you off with a question. What would you say is the 21st century equivalent of opera?
I'll define the qualities and then I'll give my answer. It would be something that people are participating in almost ambiently, social activity. In a world before phones, you had to go somewhere to do that. But I wonder if that marketplace looks more like algorithm-based content these days. That's just my thought. I welcome alternative perspectives.
All right, there you have it. TikTok, the new opera. Questions, I see.
Could you elaborate on the differences between opera and, say, live musical theater then?
There's a window. The things on either side are very clear to differentiate, but the things in that weird mushy area will fight, basically. What makes opera is generally, it's highly stylized. It's usually divorced. The plot development and the sequence of arias are not always moving in the same direction. I mentioned earlier that people would just stop and sing, and then plot would develop really quickly, and then there would be an action, and then they'd stop and they'd sing for a while. That's a very operatic context, whereas like the musical context, the singing actually develops the plot forward. We started to see this a lot in Wagner and Strauss and the experiments that came afterward, where they pressed how far they could go with the through line by making it continually sung, things like that. I think that answers your question. Lots of singing, stopping and singing, versus the singing actually develops the plot.
What's your favorite opera written in the 21st century?
In 2025, I made 2 trips to New York to see Salome. So that will be my answer.
So I noticed that you didn't mention Beethoven in any of this. Where does he fit? You mentioned Mozart, but not Beethoven.
Yeah, Beethoven wasn't very good at operas. He was a great symphonist. Like much like Wagner Wagner's shadow hung over opera after he died. Beethoven's shadow hung over basically all Viennese German language music after he died. So like 1830s versus 1880s, the art form had evolved, and Wagner was actually responding to this shadow of Beethoven. So a lot of his ideas for the Übermensch, like the idea that I have to do something that's bigger, grander, more ostentatious, that was feeding from kind of what Beethoven had done with things like his Ninth Symphony. Any other questions?
Yeah, a couple more.
I'm just wondering if what your impressions are of, is there a barrier to opera in language? Because most of them are not sort of mainstream, and that to understand the story that is going on, I'm curious if modern or 21st century opera will push past a language barrier, or if, there's a way to do that with language AI or et cetera.
Yeah, the language issue is curious. When we go back to the original intention, the Venetian model, it was going to be in Italian. It didn't matter if you were in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland. It was going to be in Italian. You didn't go to understand the words. That wasn't the point. Even I don't understand the words in English language musicals most of the time. My recommendation, if you're looking for a way to tap in, most of the program notes are shit. Most of the program notes are shit. They don't actually tell you what's going on. They don't tell you why you need to care about it. They don't ever talk about like the interaction of the music with what's happening on stage. And oftentimes the plot is sanitized to a point where I'm like, G-rated, come on. I talked about twin incest. Like, are they gonna publish that? Probably not. You're gonna hate this answer, but I would recommend doing your research beforehand. What is this? What am I about to see? But also, it's fine if you just go and you get swallowed by the sounds all around you. I take my husband to operas, whether he likes it or not. And we went to something, we went to a performance that was very much in like the modern aesthetic. Very little scenery, lighting. We just closed our eyes. We just closed our eyes and that was fine. However, we've also seen like the big explosions where like all of your senses are running all the time. So don't view the language as like the barrier to understanding. Sometimes you don't actually need to know the words because you'll figure it out.
We had a question from a shy person about Philip Glass.
Yes.
Did he do
He has done operas recently.
operas? Really? What do you think of that?
Philip Glass is an interesting aesthetic. Would I fly somewhere to see it? Probably not. If it were in Houston, would I drive? Probably. It's not my jam. After World War II, there was like a schism between the practical and the academic side of music. It wasn't even after World War II. Like the seeds were much earlier than that. But the Berg in particular, the last opera I talked about, it sounds awful. I don't enjoy listening to it. As an analytical piece, it's rich with fun things to pull out and, oh, look at that, isn't that neat? But as you're listening to it, you're like, that sounds like metal screeching. What's going on? And the reality is that they had taken music into the academic space, and I think Philip Glass lives in that academic space.
I can't be the only one that thought this, but based on your conversation, which was incredible, by the way, thank you, I can't help but wonder if it sounds like that J.R. Tolkien completely lifted the whole.
I may have selected specific facts to elucidate that.
The whole concept from Lord of the Rings seems like it was completely lifted from opera. Do you have anything to speak to that?
It's actually stolen from Norse mythology. The long bevy of characters of names that I'm going to mess up, like Fricka, they come from Norse mythology. So like Thor, the Valhalla is what falls apart. Valhalla is the kingdom of the gods, which comes from like the Norse mythology. The king Wotan is who we're dealing with in that one. He doesn't play a prominent role. Like we're used to hearing Thor, et cetera, but the ending is called Ragnarok. Uh, Copyright laws were very different back then.
Well, listen, like, a lot of people think that, like, rock and roll is a stolen genre in and of itself, right? But
I don't think there is a thing as a stolen genre. I think culture evolves and it grabs things that work and it synthesizes them. And that's really what's interesting to me about this Wagner question. For generations, there was an active debate in like, what is aesthetic? Like, yeah, it was among rich people, but like there was still a debate. But when Wagner came around, he sucked all the oxygen out of the air and he said, this is art and you will do it and you will like it. And the reality was, yeah, they liked it because it like swept them into a land of mythology and like it was intoxicating. That's the word I came up with. It was intoxicating and it wrapped an entire culture and like barreled it forward into these events that I talked about through like the solidarity and like the lack of all that discussion about what is aesthetic. So that culture should evolve. And when it doesn't evolve, you get something like Wagner.
All right, 2 more questions.
Hello, really great talk, really enjoyed it, thank you very much. I was really struck by what you were saying at the start of the talk, and many other things too, where you were showing these pictures of people milling around in the opera house. There's no seats on the ground floor. There's people in their boxes being rich. Now we don't get that. When you go to the opera, like you said, it's very Wagnerian, the lights go down, everyone shuts up. How do you think the experience of opera would change if you were experiencing it in that very 18th century way, where it's a social event, people are chatting, people are eating their sorbet? How would that change the experience? And is that a good or a bad thing?
I would love to go to a Mozart opera in that capacity. Like if I could do cozy fan tutti with like sorbet and like liquor, I would have the time of my life. It's a great comedy of errors and it's bawdy. But I would not want to see Wagner in that capacity. I saw Parsifal in Vienna once, and I made the mistake of buying standing room seats. I was a poor student. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. All I wanted to do was like shift from left to right during this 5-hour-long thing. And you can't do that because the oxygen's all been taken from the, of course I was in Vienna, which is like the holy grail. But the behaviors we've put around it, we don't enjoy opera anymore. Like that, we don't go to have fun. I go to have fun because I'm nerdy. But most of the population, I went a few shows ago. I sat in front of somebody who wore Bose headphones while they were at the opera. And I was like, why did you do this? I don't, like, it was confounding to me. I'd like to have fun at the opera again, I guess is what I'm saying.
All right,
I think we had
last
one more
question.
At the risk of being a bummer, I'm wondering if you could speak more to arts and opera and cultural expression and how it relates to nationalism and national identity.
That was actually the thesis that made me interested in this whole thing. The work I actually did was on that very quick slide about Bohemia. I spent way too much time in that little vein. When I was asked to give like some supplementary material for this talk, I included Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. It has nothing to do with Wagner. It has nothing to do with music. It has everything to do with how people start to tell stories to each other and how that stuff spreads. So I'm less interested in how can opera be that thing today. Opera served that role in the period that it did, but culture changed, blah, blah, blah. The transfiguration is still about how do the stories that we get told to us? And what do we do with that? How do I share it with you, and how do we continue with those networks? We're doing that today with TikTok content. We're doing that with YouTube content. Books are still doing that. This is how the stories are being distributed, and the same forces of patronage, who pays for it, distribution, how does it move around, and aesthetic, what's acceptable to get clicks. those forces have been around since the beginning of time, and it's just they've transfigured as technology changes, as audience. They say audience preferences, but I don't like that term. But as audience proclivities change. I'm around. Thanks.